country that was in big trouble. Now we have a country that's the talk of the world, and everybody's respecting us again, and young people are respecting us again, too. I won the young vote. The Republicans never win the young vote. I won it easily. And I want to thank Charlie, and I want to thank TikTok, and there are a lot of reasons for it. But there's never been a Republican who won the young vote, and I won the...
Listen to him speak and you can hear the unraveling of reality itself, because what we're witnessing in this moment is nothing less than the wholesale manufacture of a counter-narrative so audacious and so fundamentally disconnected from empirical truth that it would be laughable if it weren't terrifying in its implications for the future of American democracy and the very possibility of shared facts in our political discourse, because when Trump stands there claiming he won the young vote easily, thanking TikTok and Charlie Kirk for delivering this supposed youth surge, what he's doing is engaging in precisely the kind of authoritarian myth-making that Umberto Eco warned us about, where reality becomes whatever the strong man declares it to be, and here's where this gets absolutely explosive, because young voters favored Kamala Harris over Donald Trump in the 2024 election by 4 points, 51% to 47%, which means Trump didn't win anything, he lost. But watch how the MAGA propaganda machine transforms a loss into a victory through sheer rhetorical force. And this matters because the data tells us something far more disturbing than a simple lie about vote totals. What we're seeing is the successful weaponization of economic anxiety and gender polarization to fracture what should be the most progressive voting bloc in American history, and here's the bombshell that should make every progressive sit up and take notice. Much of that shift appears to be driven by young men who voted for Biden in 2020, but for Trump in 2024, and especially by young white men, with early data suggesting an extraordinary 31-point gap in youth vote choice by gender, with young women favoring Harris by 17 percentage points, and young men favoring Trump by 14 points, which represents nothing less than a catastrophic fracturing along gender lines that demands our urgent attention and analysis, because this isn't just about vote tallies, this is about the fundamental restructuring of political consciousness among an entire generation of young men who have been systematically radicalized through a sophisticated right-wing media ecosystem that we on the left have failed to adequately counter or even fully understand. And now Trump is standing there taking credit for this shift, as though it represents some kind of organic youth movement, embracing his politics when what it actually represents is the success of a deliberate and extremely well-funded effort by organizations like Charlie Kirk's Turning Point USA, which helped Trump win 47% of voters aged 18 to 29 in 2024, an 11% increase from 2020's 36% share, through aggressive campus organizing and sophisticated digital outreach that targeted young men with messages about economic grievance and cultural resentment. And let's be crystal clear about what Turning Point USA actually is, because it's an American nonprofit organization that advocates for conservative politics on high school, college, and university campuses, and has been described as the fastest-growing organization of campus chapters in America, and one of the most powerful conservative youth groups in the nation, which means they've built an infrastructure for right-wing indoctrination that operates in the very spaces where young people are supposed to be developing critical thinking skills and encountering diverse perspectives. But here's what absolutely enralds me about Trump's boast, and what should outrage every person who cares about intellectual honesty and the integrity of our democratic discourse, because when he says young people are respecting us again, what he's really doing is appropriating the language of generational politics to obscure the fact that Gen Z women are almost twice as likely to describe themselves as liberal, 47% rather than conservative, 24%, and make up the most progressive cohort of voters in the nation by far, while Gen Z Americans hold progressive positions on a wide range of public policies, both economic and cultural, at higher rates than older Americans, which means the actual ideological center of gravity for this generation remains decidedly left-wing, especially on the issues that will define their futures, like climate change and reproductive rights and economic justice, and yet Trump stands there claiming he's won their respect, when what he's actually done is exploit a particular subset of economically anxious young men through a combination of podcast appearances and TikTok videos and the relentless organizing work of Charlie Kirk's operation. And speaking of TikTok, let's pause for a moment on the sheer cynicism and hypocrisy of Trump thanking this platform, because here we have a man who, in July 2020, told reporters aboard Air Force One, "As far as TikTok is concerned, we're banning them from the United States," and then signed an executive order seeking to ban the app, suddenly reversing himself completely during the 2024 campaign, repeatedly speaking against banning TikTok, and joining TikTok to speak glowingly in support of it, which represents such a transparent exercise in electoral opportunism that it would be comical, except for the fact that it worked. It actually worked because Trump recognized that the platform has about 170 million users in the US, most of whom skew younger, a demographic that both parties are desperately trying to court, and so he simply reversed his entire position on national security grounds that he himself had previously articulated, because winning matters more than consistency, and truth doesn't matter, when you can simply manufacture a new reality through sheer force of repetition. Now let me hit you with what's really happening beneath the surface of these numbers, because when we dig into the actual issue priorities of young voters, the picture becomes even more disturbing for anyone who believes in the progressive promise of generational change, because 40% of youth chose the economy and jobs as their top priority, by far the highest of any issue, and those youth voted for Trump by a more than 22-point margin, which tells us that despite all the organizing around climate justice and reproductive rights and racial justice that has characterized youth activism over the past decade, when it came time to actually vote, economic anxiety overwhelmed everything else for a crucial segment of young voters, especially young men who have been told by a sophisticated right-wing propaganda apparatus that their economic struggles are the result of progressive policies and woke ideology, rather than the structural inequalities and corporate power that actually shape their material conditions. And here's where Charlie Kirk enters the story, as the architect of this youth radicalization pipeline, because we need to understand that Turning Point USA isn't just another conservative campus group. It already has more than 1,000 chapters in high schools across the country, and 48 representatives on staff, meant to help students organize, and since Kirk's death, the organization received 54,000 inquiries about starting new chapters within days, which represents an infrastructure of ideological recruitment that operates at a scale progressives simply haven't matched, and can't seem to match, because while we've been organizing around specific issues and specific campaigns, the right has been building permanent institutions that shape political consciousness at the most fundamental level, by getting to young people before their political identities have fully formed, and offering them a comprehensive worldview that explains their economic anxiety and cultural displacement through the lens of conservative grievance politics. The cynicism of Trump's claim about winning the youth vote becomes even more grotesque when you consider that, in the late 2010s, Generation Z was often portrayed as a progressive cohort, showing strong support for social issues such as climate change mitigation, and has been described as pro-government, and sometimes referred to as the most progressive generation ever, which means the narrative Trump is trying to construct represents a complete inversion of the actual generational story, where instead of acknowledging that he lost young voters overall and only made gains through a targeted strategy of radicalizing economically anxious young men, he's claiming some kind of wholesale youth mandate that simply doesn't exist in the data. And this matters because when political leaders can simply assert counterfactual narratives without any accountability, we lose the possibility of democratic deliberation based on shared reality. And let's talk about the specific mechanics of how this radicalization happened, because it wasn't organic, and it wasn't inevitable. Trump's youth outreach stayed mainly online. Over the summer, he was the only major Republican who joined TikTok, where he grew a follower count that now stands at 14 million, higher than Harris, who has 5 million followers. And Trump also did a number of extended interviews on some of the top podcasts in the country, many popular among young men, which represents a deliberate media strategy built on understanding that young men are increasingly consuming their media through alternative platforms outside the traditional news ecosystem, where they can be reached with messages that would never survive scrutiny in mainstream venues, messages about masculine grievance and economic nationalism and cultural resentment packaged in the aesthetic of authenticity and anti-establishment rebellion that appeals to people who feel left behind by economic and cultural change. Now I want to drive home why this moment is so dangerous for the progressive project and for democracy itself, because what Trump is doing when he boasts about winning the youth vote isn't just lying about numbers. He's constructing an alternative historical narrative that will be repeated and amplified and eventually accepted as truth by millions of his followers, who will never see the actual data showing that Harris led Trump among voters ages 18 to 29 at 51% to 47%. And this is how authoritarian movements work. They don't just win power through force, they win it through the construction of parallel realities where facts become whatever the leader says they are, and dissenting voices can be dismissed as fake news or liberal bias, or whatever rhetorical device allows supporters to maintain their belief in the infallibility of their chosen strongman. And here's something that should terrify every progressive strategist and organizer, because the gender gap among young voters represents not just a political challenge, but a civilizational crisis. In recent years, a political gender gap between Gen Z men and women emerged, with Gen Z men leaning towards conservatism and right-wing populism, and women leaning towards support for progressive and left-wing policies, and left-wing populism, a gap that has been detected by various research and numerous countries, but more predominantly in Argentina, Brazil, the United States, and South Korea, which means we're watching the emergence of a global pattern where young men and women are being sorted into opposing political camps with fundamentally incompatible worldviews, and this isn't sustainable. You cannot have a functioning democracy when an entire generation is divided along gender lines, with men embracing increasingly authoritarian and patriarchal politics, while women push for greater equality and social justice. But let's get back to the specific claims Trump is making in this clip, because every word matters and every assertion demands scrutiny. He says there's never been a Republican who won the young vote, and he claims he won it easily. And both of these statements exist in a realm somewhere between delusional fantasy and deliberate propaganda, because the claim is false, as data shows that Harris won the youth vote, not Trump. And yet, Trump can stand there and make this assertion with complete confidence, knowing that his supporters will believe him, and knowing that even when fact-checkers correct the record, it won't matter, because the correction will never reach the audiences that heard the original lie, or if it does reach them, they'll dismiss it as more evidence of media bias against their chosen leader. And I want to emphasize the role that issues are playing in this generational realignment, because this isn't just about personalities or tribal loyalties. Youth who selected climate change and abortion were much more likely to vote for Harris, and young women were more than twice as likely than young men to choose abortion as their number one priority. While these differing issue priorities, combined with the extraordinary differences in which candidate young voters preferred based on their number one issue, partially explains the wide gap between the vote choices of young men and women, which reveals how the political gender gap is being driven by fundamentally different perceptions of what issues matter most, where young women are prioritizing reproductive autonomy and climate justice, while young men are prioritizing economic concerns and immigration in ways that push them toward Trump's xenophobic nationalism. The fact that Trump is thanking TikTok specifically reveals something crucial about the nature of modern right-wing politics, because what we're seeing is the complete instrumentalization of every available platform and technology in service of power, with no concern for consistency or principle. A Trump operative working on the re-election effort said he realizes that a lot of people would be upset if it were banned, and now Trump and Biden are on opposite sides of an issue where younger voters are clearly in favor of not banning TikTok, which lays bare the pure cynicism of the position where Trump doesn't actually care about TikTok or national security or free speech. He cares about winning, and he recognized that opposing the ban would give him an advantage with young voters who use the platform regardless of his previous positions or stated concerns. And here's where we need to confront the failure of progressive politics to adequately respond to this challenge, because while Trump and Charlie Kirk were building a sophisticated infrastructure for reaching young men through podcasts and TikTok and campus organizing, the left was largely fighting defensive battles around established institutions and traditional media outlets. We didn't build a compelling counter-narrative that addressed the economic anxiety and cultural dislocation that young men were feeling. We didn't create alternative media ecosystems that could compete with the Joe Rogans and the Jordan Petersons and the Andrew Tates who were offering these young men explanations for their suffering, even if those explanations were fundamentally reactionary and often openly misogynistic. The scale of what Charlie Kirk built before his recent death cannot be overstated, because Turning Point USA's youth outreach boosted Trump votes in 2024 and conceivably made the difference, with staff of 350 claiming to run the biggest conservative movement in the country, and reporting affiliates at some 900 colleges and 1,200 high schools, believing one day it will reach every campus in the nation, which represents an institutional capacity for ideological reproduction that the left simply hasn't matched at this scale, and with this level of sophistication and resources. And we need to be honest about why that is, because it's not just about money. Although conservative megadonors have poured hundreds of millions into these youth organizing efforts, it's also about the left's tendency to prioritize purity over scale and to focus on mobilizing the already converted rather than persuading the persuadable. Now, when Trump says young people are respecting us again, what he's really revealing is the authoritarian core of his political project, because respect in Trump's vocabulary doesn't mean mutual regard or earned admiration. It means submission and deference, and the restoration of hierarchies that the movements for social justice have been working to dismantle. And this language should alarm anyone who understands that democracy requires skepticism toward power, not respect for it, requires citizens who question authority, not subjects who defer to it. And yet Trump is celebrating what he sees as a return to some imagined past where young people supposedly knew their place and respected their elders, rather than challenging systems of oppression and demanding transformative change. The demographic reality that Trump is trying to obscure is that white youth who make up 58% of the youth population voted for Trump over Harris in 2024, 54% to 44%, despite having preferred Biden in 2020, while strong majorities of Black 75% and Latino 58% youth backed Harris in 2024, though by smaller margins than they had favored Biden in 2020, which reveals that Trump's gains among young voters were concentrated primarily among white youth and particularly white men, meaning this isn't really a story about some broad youth mandate for Trumpism. It's a story about the successful mobilization of white racial resentment among a specific demographic that feels threatened by demographic change and the erosion of historical privileges. And I want to circle back to the pure audacity of Trump claiming he won the youth vote easily, when the actual margin was that he lost by 4 points, because this isn't just spin or exaggeration. This is the construction of an entirely alternative reality where losses become wins and defeats become victories through the alchemy of authoritarian rhetoric. And this should concern anyone who understands that democracy depends on the possibility of shared facts and meaningful accountability, where political leaders can be held responsible for the accuracy of their claims, and voters can make informed decisions based on reliable information about reality. But we're entering, or perhaps we've already entered, a post-truth political environment, where large segments of the electorate will simply believe whatever their preferred leaders tell them, regardless of countervailing evidence. The reference to Charlie Kirk in this clip carries particular weight now given Kirk's recent assassination, which has elevated him to martyr status within the MAGA movement, but we need to resist the hagiography and understand what Kirk actually represented, because Kirk had an extensive history of making comments that critics have deemed racist, sexist, homophobic, and Islamophobic, while building an organization that launched Professor Watchlist, a website that lists academic staff that, according to TPUSA, discriminate against conservative students, advance leftist propaganda in the classroom, and has attempted to influence student government elections in an effort to combat modern liberalism on college and university campuses, which reveals the fundamentally authoritarian nature of the project, where the goal isn't to win debates through better arguments, but to intimidate and silence opposing voices through harassment and institutional capture. What makes this moment particularly dangerous is that data from the Tufts Center shows 46% of young people voted for Trump, up from 36% in 2020, which means that even though Trump lost the youth vote overall, he made significant gains that cannot be dismissed or explained away simply by pointing to his lies about winning easily. The right has genuinely succeeded in moving a substantial portion of young voters toward their coalition, and progressives need to understand why and how this happened, rather than simply dismissing these voters as irredeemable or focusing exclusively on mobilizing our base, because if current trends continue, we could see young men and women sorted into permanently opposing political camps, with men increasingly embracing right-wing authoritarianism while women push for progressive change, and that represents an existential threat to any hope of building the broad-based coalitions necessary for transformative politics. The economic dimension of this shift cannot be ignored, because 64% of youth chose the cost of living and inflation as one of their top 3 priorities, making it far and away the biggest issue for youth, followed by healthcare, 27%, climate change and the environment, 26%, jobs and unemployment, 25%, and immigration, 24%, which reveals that despite all the attention paid to social and cultural issues, the material conditions of young people's lives are driving their political choices in ways that cut across traditional partisan divides, and this should force progressives to confront the inadequacy of a politics that emphasizes cultural representation and identity without adequately addressing the class dimensions of oppression and the ways that economic insecurity makes people vulnerable to authoritarian appeals. Trump's whole book reign performance in this clip embodies what Sartre called bad faith, where he knows he's lying, but he also knows that his audience knows he's lying, and yet everyone proceeds as though the lie were truth, because acknowledging reality would undermine the shared fantasy that holds the movement together. And this is how authoritarian movements maintain their coherence, not through genuine belief, but through collective participation in performances of loyalty, where stating obvious falsehoods becomes a demonstration of commitment to the leader and the cause. And when Trump thanks Charlie Kirk and TikTok, he's performing this ritual of attribution, where credit for his supposed victory must be distributed to allies and platforms, even though the victory itself is fictional. The generational stakes here are genuinely apocalyptic, because we're watching in real time, as the generation that should be leading the fight against climate catastrophe and building a more just and equitable society is instead being fractured along gender lines, with young men increasingly embracing the very politics of domination and hierarchy that have produced our current crises. And if progressives cannot find ways to reach these young men and offer them a politics that addresses their legitimate economic anxieties while also challenging the reactionary worldviews they're adopting, then we will lose not just elections, but the possibility of building the mass movements necessary to confront existential threats, like climate change, that require unprecedented levels of social solidarity and collective action. When Trump boasts that he won the very young vote, using that diminutive phrase as though youth were children whose support he can claim paternally, he's revealing the underlying infantilization that characterizes his relationship to all his supporters, where they exist not as autonomous political actors, making informed choices, but as followers who need his strength and leadership and vision. And this fundamentally anti-democratic conception of politics, where the leader embodies the will of the people, rather than representing their interests, is precisely what makes Trumpism such a dangerous force in American political life, regardless of whether specific claims about vote totals happen to be true or false. The final and perhaps most infuriating aspect of this clip is Trump's casual appropriation of conservative talking points about Republicans never winning the youth vote, as though his supposed achievement represents some kind of historic breakthrough, when in reality, Trump won the youth vote in 17 states this election compared to just 7 states in 2020, which does represent significant geographic gains even though he lost the national youth vote. But Trump can't acknowledge this nuance because his entire political project depends on absolute victory narratives, where he doesn't just win, he wins easily and overwhelmingly and historically, and anyone who says otherwise is lying or biased or part of a conspiracy against him. What we're left with after watching this clip is a stark choice about what kind of politics we want to build in response, because we can continue with the defensive crouch of fact-checking and correcting and pointing out lies, or we can recognize that we're in a fundamentally different kind of political struggle, where truth and falsehood matter less than the construction of compelling narratives, and the building of institutions, and the creation of alternative media ecosystems that can actually reach people where they are, with messages that address their real material concerns, and if we choose the latter path, we have to be willing to learn from what the right has done successfully with Charlie Kirk and Turning Point USA and the podcast ecosystem, while also remaining true to our core commitments to justice and equality and genuine democracy, rather than the authoritarian simulacrum that Trump offers. This isn't just about one election or one lie about vote totals. This is about the long-term project of building a genuinely inclusive left politics that can speak to economic anxiety without scapegoating immigrants, that can address cultural dislocation without retreating into nationalism, that can offer young men a positive vision of masculinity that doesn't require the subordination of women, and that can build the mass movements necessary to confront existential threats like climate catastrophe, while also addressing the immediate material needs that drive people's political choices. If we cannot do this, then clips like this one where Trump simply asserts victory in the face of defeat will continue to work because his supporters will continue to choose the comforting lie over the uncomfortable truth, and the rest of us will be left shouting into the void about facts that nobody's listening to anymore.